Yeah, so this idea of trying to balance water for people and river ecosystems, all in the context of trying to basically develop science to support sound water management decisions. This is like a critical thing in this region, as all of you know. And it's a really difficult problem because we want to use our water and we have lots of different water users. We have ecosystems that are trying to function. We have recreational fisheries, farms, et cetera. And so we're working on this big picture of trying to find trade-offs in using water and sustaining our natural ecosystems. And of course, this is a massive topic, right? And it's one that can't really be solved. You know, these big water management decisions can't be approached by just dealing with the natural and physical sciences. We've got to pull from all these different disciplines, including things like policy, economics, and understanding people's values and perspectives. And so, you know, part of our goal here, long-term goal, the idea though for our initiative is this big picture, right? And so our group is really trying to develop teams over the next few years to try to tackle these truly multidisciplinary problems. And so we're trying to bring in farm economists, policymakers, and other social scientists into our team of natural and physical scientists. But what I want to do today is narrow in a bit. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is kind of the first steps in this process, which is focused on the natural and physical sciences, and in particular, dealing with the relationships between freshwater ecology and so as a first step in this process, we're working on a proposal that's a little more narrowly focused on this area, which is basically trying to gain a mechanistic understanding of the relationships between river flow regimes and ecosystem processes. I think that, you know, this is a small piece of the puzzle, but it's super, super important because the decisions we're making about water aren't simple. They're not, should we use water, should we not use water? They're nuanced. When can we use water? How much water can we use? And importantly, what are the consequences for the river ecosystem? I'm going to argue, and what we're going to try to argue in this proposal is that we're not there yet. In fact, we're far way off of understanding those critical relationships. So I want to give you a bunch of background about this topic, and then I want to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about our objectives for the proposal, and hope to get your feedback on kind of where we're headed. Hopefully I'll end a little early so we can do that. Okay, that looks weird too. Every discipline has these key papers, right, that kind of move the field forward, change the way we think about our field, and this is one of them. That should say the natural flow regime up there. This is a paper by Leroy Poff and his colleagues almost 25 years ago, where they basically introduced this new paradigm for thinking about river flow and the characteristics of river flow, and basically acknowledging that things like climate and geology set the stage regionally for how flows manifest throughout the year. And we now understand that the natural flow regime is critically important for biology. Not only are flow regimes important for physical characteristics, like setting the stage for geomorphic change, we know that the flow regimes are important for driving dynamics of chemical constituents and change over time. But we also know that flows are really important in terms of providing a really strong selective force that drives life history evolution of things like this beautiful mayfly here and this trout that have been exposed to these flow regimes literally for millennia. Right? In cases where flow regimes are really predictable, these interactions between flow and biology are super, super strong. Right? And so, as many of you know, around here, we have this sort of snowmelt dominated flow regime. And the big event, of course, is this pulse of runoff during the spring. And this has led to a whole range of behaviors and life history events, the emergence of mayflies, the spawning of trout, things like that, where the species are really cued into this flow event. And so there's a really strong connection between a natural flow regime and the natural functioning and resilience of river ecosystems. But of course, we know that flows are changing. These are data from Steve Hostetler and Kathy Whitlock's Greater Yellowstone assessment that basically just shows that in response to climate, the phenology of flows, the timing of flows is changing. And so we're now seeing higher and earlier flows in the spring, and of course, reduced and prolonged low flows during the summer and fall. And so this is a disruption to the biota in these ecosystems. And given our best projections for the future, we know that these things are likely to just intensify, right? So higher highs during the spring, lower lows during the summer and fall. The effects of climate on flow have probably received most of the press and most of the attention in terms of the science. But I'm going to argue that there's a much bigger lever on flow regimes in our area in the Western U.S. And of course, that's irrigated agriculture. So, you know, despite the importance of irrigation for for producing food, for our culture, for our heritage, and so forth, there's no getting around the fact that it's the largest consumptive user of water in the West. This is data from the Upper Missouri River Basin, just showing all the different consumptive uses of water. And of course, irrigation is massive. It's over 80% of the consumption. And that's water that's consumed. It's evaporated or evapotranspirated and lost from the watershed, right? So it's gone. It's been pretty hard in the past to get good estimates of what this means for stream flow. What are the potential effects of irrigation on flow regimes? But that's changing. David Ketchum was a student at the University of Montana, working in Kelsey Genso's lab, and he did some amazing stuff during his dissertation. This is one of those things. He developed this really ingenious machine learning approach for basically mapping, high-resolution mapping of irrigated agriculture all across the West. He was able to do this at like a 30-meter grid scale, and going back to the 80s. And so we now have this amazing data set of spatial and temporal variation in irrigation across the West. He was also able to use various algorithms to estimate the relationship between irrigation and water consumption. So he sort of climate corrected his data and has really solid and precise estimates of water used by irrigation. And so he was really interested in what are the potential impacts of irrigation on stream flow? And how does water use by stream flow compare to the amount of water that's flowing in our rivers all across the West? And this is a paper that he has in review right now, which I think is fascinating, where he compares this ratio of irrigation water use for various basins all across the West to the amount of stream flow coming out of that basin on an annual basis. Okay? And what he's finding is that in many of these river basins, the amount of water consumed by irrigation is nearly equal to the total amount of stream flow leaving that gauge for the entire year at the outlet. This is kind of an extreme example here. This is the Snake River near Murphy, Idaho. And you can see the orange bars going back to the mid 80s or so. The orange bars are the amount of irrigation water use between April and October during the irrigation season. The blue bars are the total annual volumes of stream flow. And for many of those years, they're more or less similar. Okay, so irrigation is having a major impact on the amount of potential stream flow in our rivers. Of course, we're interested in regimes and shifts in the timing of flow, and so we need to be thinking about these things at shorter time steps. These are data that David sent me where he used kind of the same metric of irrigation water use to stream flow on a monthly basis for a bunch of gauges in the Upper Missouri River Basin. And a couple of things to note. Just first, most of this, of course, is occurring during the peak of irrigation season. There's a lot of variation among these different gauges in terms of the amount of irrigation relative to stream flow leaving that gauge. So there's a lot of interesting variation. And yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. There's a lot of water that you know that could potentially be in stream flow. Now, I kind of look at these data in an optimistic way, in the sense that this to some degree represents adaptive potential. We can't expect farmers to not farm and to not use this water, but there's a huge amount of potential for, if we can understand more about the influence of water on ecosystems, if we can incentivize farmers, and if we can sort of really try to understand these trade-offs, we've got some adaptive potential to work with here. But this still leaves us with this really difficult question of if we're able to try to restore natural flow regimes, how much water does a river need, right, to sustain its natural functions? This is something that people have been grappling with for a long time, and it's led to basically a whole field of study called environmental flows. And this is basically the efforts to just understand flows required to both sustain healthy and naturally functioning rivers, but also our livelihoods and the well-being that depend on these ecosystems. And so there's been a huge amount of work in this regard. One of the more accepted frameworks early on was the Aloha framework, ecological limits of hydrologic alteration. This was basically kind of a complex set of processes for trying to understand what's the hydrology of the system, how has that hydrology been altered, how do those alterations in hydrology influence ecology? And I'm going to highlight that because I think that's really important component of this. How do changes in hydrology influence ecology? And even things like social processes. So what are the acceptable conditions for flow? How do we implement those? And then sort of integrate it in an adaptive management framework. A more recent perspective that we heard about last week in our ecology seminar is the functional flows approach. This is an approach they're starting to apply in California, where the basic idea is that if we're going to balance water for people and water for rivers, let's figure out which are those key flows that are critical for maintaining ecological function, right? And if we can do that, we stand a better chance of sort of meeting these kinds of trade-offs. There are other approaches too, the range of variability approach and so on. This is a whole science unto itself. But what I'd like to argue is that, despite these efforts, they all assume that we have a really strong understanding of the relationship between flow and ecological responses. Okay, and I think that's just not true. How robust really is our understanding of the relationships between flow and river ecology? This is a paper that came out a few years ago in Science by Margaret Palmer and Albert Rudy, talking about just this issue that if we want to restore rivers, if we want to get back to naturally functioning systems, we really need to advance our mechanistic understanding of how flows influence ecology. So we're not quite there. Part of the reason is that the relationships that have been developed, many of them are quite qualitative. So we understand qualitatively that changes in discharge influence some more or less subjective metric of river ecosystem health. Some of these relationships are quantitative, but they're phenomenological. So in the Clark Fork River, for example, until recently, we know that minimum flows have a positive effect on the number of brown trout caught in the river. But the issue is that, this is a phenomenological relationship. We don't understand the mechanisms between flow and fish production. These are data that Tim Klein sent me that he's been working with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, looking at relationships between flow and fish data in a bunch of rivers across Montana. And this is the beaverhead. So these are rainbow trout and brown trout population sizes over time. In relation to the dashed blue line is mean summer discharge, lagged by a couple of years because these are a couple-year-old fish. And you can see there's an obvious pattern here, right? There's an obvious relationship between flow and the abundance of these fishes, but we still don't know why. Okay? And I think that's really important because we don't know what components of the flow regime are influencing these populations. So the timing is critical in terms of understanding that. We don't know the mechanisms by which flow links to the production of fish. And we also, if these mechanisms break down, all of a sudden there's not a relationship. We have no basis for trying to understand how to manage that change, right? So understanding the mechanisms is critically important. So this is really guiding our first proposal, this question: what are the ecological mechanisms that link flow regime to fish populations? So that's kind of our our big, simple question. We are hoping to study rivers in the upper Missouri headwaters. That looks a little funky, that's okay. Because this is such an important part of our region. It's heavily irrigated and there's lots of variation in irrigation. There's also these really important recreational fisheries that people care a lot about. So we're hoping to choose study sites in this basin that represent basically a range of irrigation intensity and water withdrawal. Try to sort of target how water withdrawals are influencing these ecosystems. And so these are kind of endpoints. You can think of these flow regimes as endpoints in the upper Missouri, where we have some systems that have natural flow regimes that look something like this. And then this yellow line would be a typical kind of heavily irrigated ecosystem. So what we want to do is very strategically, using this irrigation data from David Ketchum, choose sites that vary across this gradient and then study them intensively to understand the relationships between flow and fish production. These are characteristic flow regimes taken from the Gallatin River, Gallatin Gateway, and Logan downstream. So a big component of this is for sure irrigation and water use that occurs between the canyon and Logan downstream. Now, there are many ways to think about this question, and everyone with a different hat on would have a different way of studying this. What we're really excited about is trying to look at this through the lens of ecosystem energetics and basically acknowledging that the production of fish ultimately depends on energy supply relative to their energetic demands. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. What we're hoping to do is build sort of quantitative food webs for these rivers across this range of irrigation, basically following production from the base to the top of the food web, energy production by primary producers, the flows of that production to invertebrates that feed fish, and then of course production and energy demands of fishes at the top of the food web. What we think is more novel about what we want to do, though, is we'd like to get at these questions in a phenological sense. And so really trying to nail down changes in energy supply over the course of the year in terms of both primary production and invertebrate production relative to energy demands by fish. And so kind of where we're going with this is that their changes to flow may lead to matches or mismatches between the supply of energy and the demands of fishes. And so we can then think about things like dampening peak flows. If irrigation is shaving off the tops of these peak flows, what are the responses of the ecosystem, reduce summer flows, and so on. So this is kind of providing the basis for where we're headed for this. How do we do that? How do we go about getting at the energetic basis of these rivers? Well, one of the ways that we can go about that is measuring ecosystem metabolism. And this is essentially just the balance of gross primary production by autotrophs, things like algae and aquatic plants, the respiration of those things, but also the collective respiration of all the heterotrophs in the ecosystem. And the balance, of course, is net ecosystem production. And we tend to think of gross primary production in these large, well-lit systems as a pretty good proxy for the total energy available to support higher trophic levels. To measure this, we can basically construct oxygen budgets for segments of river, measuring all the inputs and outputs of oxygen that are driven by biological processes, but also things that we can correct for things like air, water, gas exchange, groundwater inputs, and stuff like that. We're really fortunate in Montana that some of my closest colleagues are basically pros in this stuff. They sort of wrote the book on understanding how to measure and model ecosystem metabolism, especially under variable flow. So we've got a good set of collaborators that know how to do this kind of stuff. Technology is also really changing and helping us understand the metabolism of rivers. So it used to be really difficult to measure primary production and respiration in streams because you had to go out and collect a bottle of water every hour and then do benchtop Winkler titrations in the lab. And so you're lucky if you got a day's worth of data to try to understand how the ecosystem works. Moving into the 90s, and then now we have these really cheap deployable optical sensors that are just awesome. And we can put them in rivers, and because of our friends who know how to model this stuff, can now get really amazing continuous estimates of the river breathing, basically producing and consuming organic matter and energy over time. And this has motivated a lot of critical thinking about rivers, and particularly in the context of not just things like flow regimes, but metabolic regimes. So how do rivers, how does the production and consumption of organic matter change over time? How does it vary among rivers? It's just really opened up this huge opportunity for better understanding the ecology of rivers. One of the things that has emerged from the early sets of data like this that are coming out is that flow regimes are really, really important in driving these patterns. We can compare patterns of ecosystem metabolism and say rivers with stable or unstable flows and look at how much energy is produced in those different types of systems. We can zoom in and basically, whoops, oh, that's too bad. We can zoom in to these data and see that small changes in discharge have huge effects on gross primary production. So we'll see an individual flood, and during that flood, primary production will basically just turn off, right? And so there's a really tight connection between flow and the production of energy. We also know that part of that is driven by, of course, things like turbidity, and turning off the lights in the water. But we also know that based on this recent work, that high flows are really important because they scour the bottom of these rivers, right? They basically roll rocks, and that has a huge influence on primary production. This is kind of exciting, this work by Joanna Blasek that shows that there are sort of critical threshold flows that drive big drops in primary production, and they're related to the biomass dynamics in these rivers, right? So we're starting to understand for different rivers, where are these critical levels of discharge, and how does that influence ecosystem metabolism? And of course, if we think about this in the context of the work that we want to execute here, big changes in peak flows might be critically important for rivers, especially if dampening those peak flows brings us below these thresholds that affect the biota, right? So big potential effects of changes in flow regime on ecosystem metabolism. Okay, so I'm getting to the final part of this, and this is where it gets a little more rough. I mean, it's kind of been rough already, but what I want to do is kind of just put forth our objectives in this proposal and then talk about some of our predictions and hopefully generate some conversation. I think I'm going to end early. So for the first objective in this work, what we're thinking is that we basically want to quantify the phenology and magnitude of energy supply as ecosystem metabolism and invertebrate production. But we want to do this in response to variation in the flow regime. And essentially what we're predicting is that under natural flow conditions, we'll see two distinct peaks in primary production, right? So one peak in the spring prior to snowmelt, as the river starts to warm up a little bit, and importantly, as the day length starts to change, we think that we should see this pulse of primary production prior to snowmelt. Another really important sort of amount of production that's happening during the summer, during snowmelt recession, and into the summer and fall. So this is kind of the dynamics that we expect. It's interesting to note that there are very few data sets in snowmelt-driven rivers. They're actually hard to find. And so just doing this will be a contribution. It's because people are afraid to lose their loggers, or they don't want to get cold or something like that. But Tim has graciously agreed to go out there every day and check on these probes. Now, under altered flow regimes, things like dampened peak flows and reduced low flows in response to irrigation, or earlier snowmelt in response to changes in climate, we of course expect the phenology and the magnitude of energy to change, the energy that's available to support consumers. And so if snowmelt comes earlier, we expect some of this production, this critical production, to be shaved off, right? So lower amounts of production there. And during the lower flows in the summer and fall, we expect this sort of hump of GPP to shift over. So the phenology of when that production is occurring to shift over here. Also, if we remove those big peak flows, then of course we expect more GPP, right? Because the rocks haven't been scoured. As soon as snowmelt recession happens, those things are just ready to start cranking away. And so these are kind of our basic predictions for how we expect phenology of these things to change. Now, when we think about primary production and when we report it in papers and when we talk about it, we're usually talking about the amount of material produced per square meter per time, right? So we're always thinking about this and reporting on a per square meter basis. But if you think about rivers and their response to flow, the rivers expand and contract massively, right? And so we really need to be thinking about this concept, and that is that flow has a really strong effect on ecosystem size. So if we think about various levels of water withdrawal in rivers or changes during the snowmelt recession, these things basically just affect productive area, the total area, right? And so what we also want to do in this work is generate some understanding of how flow influences ecosystem size and what that means for total production. So not thinking about production on a per area basis, but thinking about total production in these river segments. But if you think about a fish, you know, they sort of care less about what's happening in this per square meter. The amount of food available for fish is generated by the amount of ecosystem that's in their range of foraging, right? So this is something that we need to address. And I don't know of any papers or any studies that are going down this path. So excited about that. What do we expect in terms of the next sort of trophic position, the invertebrates and their production? How do we expect them to respond to changes in flow? We can look to a few studies around here to try to help us puzzle through this. This is kind of cool. This is a figure from a dissertation here at MSU 35 years ago, Dan Gustafson. Some of you know Dan, probably. Did some just beautiful, beautiful work on the life histories or the life cycles of invertebrates in the Gallatin River. This is just, I think, 6 or 7 species of mayfly, but he did this for every species in the river. And what it allows us to do is kind of look at periods of the year where we have rapid change in body size and rapid growth, right? And if you look at this for a while, what you start to see is that there are periods of the year where the slopes of these lines are the steepest, right? So just prior to snowmelt, you can see that a few of these species just start to take off. So those invertebrates are kind of taking advantage of that spring warming, taking advantage of that pulse of primary production and growing really rapidly and emerging. Others undergo the same sort of situation as snowmelt is receding. So this is a really key time for invertebrate production. And then some of these species have life histories where a little bit later in the summer and early fall is when they're completing their life cycle. So based on data like this, we can start to think about when do we expect those pulsed times of production to occur. One of my students, Jim Junker, that some of you also know, a long time ago, did a study on the west black-tailed Deer Creek in Yellowstone. And he was interested in this question of seasonality and phenology of production. You can see there's some data up here on top of the discharge and temperature, but here's his estimate, modeled estimates of net primary production. And you can see that he's predicting these 2 pulses, one in the spring prior to snowmelt, and of course a big pulse of production in the summer. And what he found was that there are pulses of invertebrate biomass in the system, maybe lagged a little bit, and production. So this is total community secondary production through time. And you can see that most of the production occurs after snowmelt from July through going into October. But there is kind of a hint that there's a bump in the spring here prior to snowmelt. So we have some basis of thinking that the phenology of invertebrate production should somewhat should track the phenology of their food. Now, in terms of responses of invertebrate production to changes in their food resource, yeah, what do we expect there? So what we're predicting is that these populations have some degree of phenological flexibility. And so many of these things are likely to maintain synchrony between times of high production of algae and their highest times of production. But again, because ecosystem contraction, just this ecosystem size matters so much, we expect that total production will decline substantially in response to irrigation. So that leaves us with the second objective, where we're going to focus on the other side of this equation, which is energy demand by fishes. And what we're predicting is that under natural flow conditions, we more or less expect the phenology of the energetic demands of fish to be synchronous with the supply of their food. And so during this time of this pulse of production prior to snowmelt, we think this is a really important period of growth potential for these fishes. The temperatures aren't too hot yet. There's plenty of food available, so that their growth versus their metabolic needs is kind of high. Into the summer, we think that, you know, as snowmelt recedes, a lot of resources are available to support young of the year that are coming out of the gravel. And then later in the summer, there's plenty of resources around to support the metabolic needs of these adult fish that may not be growing, but to maintain their condition require a good amount of resource supply. So this is kind of what we expect under natural flow conditions. Under altered flow regimes, what we expect is that resource supply will be constrained. So that critical time during the spring, the amount of energy available for these fishes will be reduced. And then into the summer, a huge reduction in resource supply that's driven by contraction of the size of the river. And, you know, that affecting both young of the year production, but also as we move further into the summer, fish struggling to get enough energy just to maintain their metabolic demands. Okay? So that's big picture of kind of where we're headed in this work. Just a few things maybe to take home, and then questions and get some discussion going. First, changes to flow regimes obviously threaten the natural functioning and structure of rivers, but our understanding of these relationships between flow and ecology is really limited. And that's kind of surprising, isn't it? It's something that seems so important. We just have a very little understanding of that. Irrigation water use is likely having larger effects on flow regimes than climate change. Don't quote me on that. But I think it's something that, you know, there's a lot of evidence that it's at least as big of a deal as climate change. We need to be paying attention to it. We think an energetics approach could provide important information about how flow regimes influence fish population success. This is why we want to kind of go down this route. And we're hoping that this type of information could help inform these more nuanced decisions about when is water needed, at what times, and how much to support the energetic demands of these fishes. So that's what I have. I'm going to leave you with a lovely picture of what Tim thinks are whitefish. I thought they were trout, foraging in a nice, shallow, warm area of the Gallatin River this summer. So thanks. Let's, yeah, if I.
Do you think massive floods like the Yellowstone got a couple years ago, would that delay primary production for a longer period in that year? Or would it still happen as soon as like the flows recede that it would pop up?
I think the key is like the timing of the recession flows, which apparently, you know, isn't always correlated with the size of the snowmelt. But it seems like, yeah, things really start cranking when you get down to a certain level Yeah. No question that flood had a huge effect on. That wasn't. Yeah, Jack.
Great presentation. But maybe this is a naive question, it's well understood, but I'm wondering about the relationship between scouring flows and GPP and your hypothesis that decreasing peak flows would actually increase GPP. Now we can think of, the obvious cases where the scour just results in bare rock and there's no GPP, but maybe that's a transient or lagged response. But now is the idea, what about like self-shading or inhibition? I mean, these aren't like towerous biomes or, I'm just wondering, like, I can imagine it with MPP, if you're accumulating biomass, that getting bigger because it hasn't been removed, Sycamore Creek type of situation. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Could the scouring flows actually stimulate GPP per area?
It's a good question. Yeah. So, yeah, I think certainly later in the summer when you get these big mats of cladophora or something, then sure, on an aerial basis, you've got could have self-shading biology and reduced area-specific rates of GPP. Again, I don't think that those dynamics are as important as just ecosystem size in this case. But see what you're saying. So like sometimes, yeah, just grazing or scouring can kind of increase aerial GPP and over long periods of time. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, not a good answer. Yes.
Oh, Wyatt, really, really nice. I do wonder about other controls. So I like, the energy approach is powerful. But one has to think about stream temperature and predators at low flows. I wonder about either including them as potential drivers in the analysis or controlling for them. For example, do changes in dissolved oxygen and temperature influence, do they affect fish via energy demand or other ways? And how would you account for those or control for those under either case?
I think there's a definite there's a correlation between flows and temperature, big time. So super low extended flows lead to much higher temperatures. And yeah, that has a direct effect on the physiology of these fishes. They're bioenergetic. So they have a higher basal metabolism. So they have a higher energy requirement just to sustain their metabolism. And can either start losing weight or they can eat more and maintain their.
And you have physiological models that take that into account. So when you show energy demand, it's already accounted for temperature, for example.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. What else did you say though? Temperature and.
Well, dissolved oxygen, but also competitors. The TED talk last week was notable in hypothesizing that certain flows hurt invasives more than natives, and as a consequence, there's a net benefit for natives.
Yeah, I mean, I see that the competition thing is competition for resources, right? So I think as these rivers kind of contract and you have less space, there's less energy being produced, and so that's those fish have a higher degree of competition. I think influences their growth rates, population sizes, and so on. Yeah, those are kind of folded in there to some degree. Disease is another thing that we're not thinking about.
There's another one.
Yeah.
Great talk. But okay, so I have to think about nutrients because picture of the irrigation system and the location of these riverine systems relative to agriculture. You're going to have runoff, but you're also going to have more concentration of nutrients as the water evaporates in the riparian system. So how do you account for adjacency of potential nutrients coming off of farmland, but also the concentration of nutrients as the water table goes down?
Yeah, I think those, right. I mean, that's going to influence concentrations of nutrients, something we can't really control for. This is one of the limitations of kind of developing an observational study across. So there's certainly likely to be higher nutrient concentrations where you have higher irrigation and lower flows. So we're not going to really control for that. We're hopefully going to be measuring that and trying to account for that. Even still, I think that nutrients are going to influence production on an aerial basis. And what's maybe more important here is total area. Yeah. Yep.
Thinking about total area, are you considering irrigation canals for that?
I don't care about those.
Because they obviously have some production.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's not, we weren't thinking about incorporating that into this study. It's obviously, they're super extensive and really important, as you know. But in terms of the fishes and what's kind of fueling although, I mean, some of these fishes get into these irrigation canal systems, right? And we don't know a lot about the ecology in there, but no, that's just too complicated, Nate. Yeah.
Great. Think about. I have some questions related to nutrients too, but I think would prefer to pivot to thinking about whether you'll avoid the Madison because of dam regulation and focus on Gallatin Jefferson that are more just irrigation effects on an otherwise unregulated flow.
I think that right now we're kind of, if we're sort of targeting an NSF proposal, we would try to not confound things by looking at regulated rivers and unregulated rivers, kind of find reaches that are unregulated and that vary in irrigation withdrawals. I think as part of a broader understanding of these things, it's absolutely critical that we think about regulated and unregulated systems. Because they're really different. They have more control in regulated systems to make a difference, right? If there's storage water available to change flows, then there's a lot more potential for adaptation in those systems. It's a good question.
Maybe one more?
Yes.
I'm also thinking about irrigation and return flows and like thinking about irrigation management implications from this work where you could have an irrigator over irrigate. It would also maybe put more nutrients into the river, but at lower concentrations. I don't know, does this work intend to go down thinking about that in terms of getting water necessary for agriculture, but back into the river system?
In the broadest sense, that's really important. Irrigation return flows and understanding the hydrology and the timing of return flows and the amounts and those things can be really important for fishes in terms of providing cold water later in the season and so forth. But we hadn't thought about incorporating that at this stage. I know there's a lot of interest in that. David Ketchum, the guy who's now at DNRC, is I think he's trying to work on hydrologic models that incorporate that and do a better job of understanding the amount of return flow. But we're not not yet there.
Well, let's thank Wyatt again.